Yeah, so anyway, I've called this talk From Tech Support to Tech Ethics, Following My Conscience, because I was asked to give a talk basically about well, it was sort of a how to get a career in tech ethics. And when I sort of thought about the how to get a career in tech ethics prompt, I realized that my career path was definitely not how to get a career in tech ethics talk. It was a how I meandered my way along until I bumped into tech ethics. So I thought, so I spoke to John about these things, so that sounded like an interesting approach to take. So I'm going to basically tell you a little bit about how that happened for me and where the decision points were sort of along the way, and a little bit about some of the projects that I've worked on and where I think the next set of challenges lie in terms of technology ethics. So for those who don't know me, there's a little agenda. I'm just going to cover a bunch of different topics. I'm just going to move this little chat window out of the way because it is actually in my way. Yeah, so basically I'm going to go through who I am, some early days stuff, just take you through a little bit of my background and where I've come from so that you can understand what where I'm at with this stuff. Why working in industry wasn't really up for me because originally I was in industry, and how I kind of bumped into things as I went along and ended up making myself much more invested in following this slightly bumpy path of interesting stuff that caught my eye, and I got involved in things. So yeah, and then where I am today, and where next for ethics, basically. So we'll see what I think at the end there. So at the moment, I am a professor of ethics and games technology at the University of Staffordshire, previously Staffordshire University, but we've just rebranded, so I now have to say University of Staffordshire. And I come to that through basically having done a PhD in computer ethics, which I'll talk a little bit more about later, and a Bachelor of Science with majors in computer science and history and philosophy of science at the University of Sydney. And yeah, I mean, after that, I've done a bunch of postdocs, and then I got a lectureship at De Montfort University, where I was for about 12 years. And Bernd Stahl, who's on the call, used to be my boss, so hi Bernd. He will feature heavily throughout this talk too, so if you know Bernd, you'll see some older pictures of him as we go along as well. So we can play Where's Wally with Where's Bernd. So yes, anyway, back in the early days though, I was born in I was born in 1980. So my first real experience with computers was when the school actually so there's a couple of things that happened around about the same time. So from 1985, my dad was a big nerd, and he brought home one of the first IBM compatible PCs. And on that, he'd loaded some games because he wanted us to get interested in, so my sister and I, so I was about 5, my sister's about 3, but he wanted us to get kind of interested in computers. So he loaded some games on it, and we used to, well, up until quite a while, we used to play all sorts of games on that, but mostly this is my favorite one. It was called Castle Adventure. It was a very early hard-coded, I mean, these days, like the sort of game would be like a roguelike dungeon crawler, but it wasn't actually a roguelike. It was just a set dungeon adventure with some puzzles in it. And I kept breaking the game by accidentally, because it was all done in ASCII art, essentially, and it was and I kept breaking the file kept getting corrupted, and so you could break out through the walls of the dungeons and through the castle, and I used to love kind of hacking my way around the outside of the castle and kind of beating the game that way. So that was sort of some of my early experiences with games. Also, my dad came down and taught kindergarten, got a BBC microcomputer. And my dad came down because he was a COBOL programmer and you had to do programming and stuff like that. He came down and taught us some basic programming to learn how to make little sprites move across the screen. And I was really rubbish at that. I basically, the sprite didn't work, and I got very upset apparently about this. So I was a very bad programmer from the very beginning. Later on, I actually dropped out. I just didn't really look at computers again, because back between the 1992, apart from playing the occasional competitive game of like my sister and I used to try to beat each other's Space Invaders scores and things on this really old computer. Apart from that sort of thing, I mean, girls didn't use computers, so I didn't do computers. We had like one computer room at school. And it was used just to learn how to do word processing. Like, we didn't do anything other than that. I think the hardest it got was we laid out like a brochure or something like that. So that was the sort of computing that I learned at school. And then in 1997, I met a boy and I liked him, and he was a computer programmer, and I wanted to impress him. So I installed Linux, as you do, and learned how to program very basic HTML. And I also started learning a bit of PHP as well at the time. But he also tried to teach me C, which was just a completely lost cause. But anyway, I ended up doing okay with C, but I've forgotten most of it now. Anyway, so at the time, because I was trying to impress this person, this is me circa 1999. I would have been in the first year of university here. And I just got my new glasses because I'd been working at the screen so hard that like I have an astigmatism, and I started getting these massive headaches, which I never had before, because I never really worked with screens that close. Anyway, I really wanted to get into veterinary science, but I didn't get into I didn't get the marks, the grades for veterinary science, which were very, very high at in Sydney. Very, very, very competitive course to get onto, one of the top courses. So instead, I was looking. I went with my dad to an open day, and they had this brand new course called bioinformatics. And I was like, well, it's biology, which I like. That's kind of like animals and things, which I like. And maybe I can do the computing bit and impress my new boyfriend. So I ended up taking that one on. And basically, at the University of Sydney, it was a new course. And they took essentially a major in computer science and a major in biology, and they kind of smushed them together. You could do like double majors and stuff in Australian universities. It's pretty cool, which is why I have a double major, but not, as you'll have, if you have a good memory, not in computer science and biology or bioinformatics at all, in fact. So anyway, while I was at university in Australia, the kind of classic university model is you actually stay at home and you go to university, so you don't tend to go away unless you're moving to another state, and not a lot of people do that. So I was quite unusual in that I wanted to move out and go and live with some friends in a share house. That was actually quite unusual, but it meant that I wanted to be independent and I had to work to pay the rent. So I ended up working just at the end of the dot-com bust. It was busting basically as I was starting work. And so there weren't as many jobs around as there had been. But I basically took up a tech support job at a very large recording studio, which has now since disappeared, but it was Festival Mushroom Records. They had all the big Australian names, so Kylie, Silverchair, Nick Cave, all these, the big Australian names, and a bunch of other people as well. And I worked as a tech support. I was like the only female tech support officer there. And I basically ran around and fixed people's computers. Now, back in the days of the late 90s, early 2000s, for those who remember it, there was not a lot of security. And I mean, I used to go in and basically the way to kind of fix someone's computer was to go in and ask them what their password was and then mess around with their computer and then, log out at the end, sort of thing. But yeah, there wasn't really a way to kind of do it from an administrative perspective. And so, yeah, it was not great in terms of security. And the other thing that they had within this big recording studio was they had a big intranet. They actually had one, it was surprisingly, the guy who was in charge of the tech support sort of section was really into like wikis and things from a very early stage. And so he set up this whole intranet that was like a wiki and a bunch of other things. But for a while, it hosted a load of files basically that were the main information that people across the company would have to work with it, like each other. It was like a SharePoint, right? But it was not as good as SharePoint. And it was just essentially an FTP. They just had an FTP server essentially. So I noticed that when I was doing the intranet, like we had to kind of maintain the intranet, and all the files are basically available to anyone who could log into the intranet, which was everyone. So basically everybody could have access to most of the files that were on this intranet, including the spreadsheet that had all of the names, addresses, names, home addresses, home phone numbers, mobile phone numbers, email addresses, etc., of all of the big stars that they'd signed. And I was like, surely this can't be good, right? Like, I could go and just give this to somebody who really wanted it, and they could probably do quite a bit of mischief with this, right? And so this is when I started kind of getting a little bit of a sense of, wait, it's not all roses in tech. Like, it's not, I mean, first we had the dot-com bust where people are kind of inflated and inflated the value of these companies. And then, this there seemed that there was something problematic with being able to essentially like $14 an hour tech support person could get access to lots of very sensitive information about people who are very, very high profile, right? And that was when kind of my conscience started getting kind of, geared up a little bit. I was like, yeah, I'm not sure this is so good. And then there were lots of issues that went on at the recording studio. So the fact that I was the only female tech support person meant that I was subject to a lot of sexism. I mean, recording the music industry is not known for its particularly favorable conditions for women just to start with, but it was like doubly it was really problematic. Like that, a lot of the executives would have deliberately, so I was telling you about the passwords and things like that, a lot of the executives would have deliberately sexist or sexual passwords, so they would have to tell me this particular password that I would have to type in, and there would be some, and it was really quite horrible, to be honest. Lots of really, just not very nice things going on there. But anyway, so the fact that I had to work meant that I actually started failing at university because, yeah, exactly. I agree, Suki. Yes. That's exactly how I felt. And felt even worse. Like, it felt kind of normal at the time. That was the thing. Like, it was just normal at the time. That was just how things were. And so, like, I think back on it, and I feel more horrified for my previous self than I was at the time. So, yeah. But it's good. I think it's good that we're now horrified about this stuff, and because it was fairly normal back then. Anyway, so unfortunately though, having to work to pay my rent and that, because I had to work 2.5 days a week, meant that I was missing a lot of my university classes, and particularly my three-hour lab sessions for biology that I had to do each week. So it'd be like 3 hours on a Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, and I'd have to work on the Wednesday afternoon and the Friday or something like that. So I missed half of them, and basically I went to the lecturers and I said, look, is there any other way of doing this? Because this is just not going to work. And the guy just basically said, no, sorry, that's just how it is. You're gonna have to do something else. So I was very upset about that because I really liked biology and I wanted to do more of it, but I was like, well, I guess that's that then. But it turned out that a lot of people were having the same sort of thing with this bioinformatics degree. A lot of people were either picking the computer science part or the biology part because it just wasn't a very well designed program, to be honest. And so I basically went back to the computer science part because at least they didn't have 3 hours worth of labs. So that meant I had a whole load of credit point hours that I had to pick up. So I had to kind of find another thing to do. And a friend of mine who was at the university at the time said, well, I'm going to be doing this second year module called Introduction to Philosophy of Science. That sounds like it could be easy at least. Maybe do you want to come and do that with me? So I was like, oh yeah, philosophy of science. I've read I read Sophie's Choice at one point, surely it could be interesting. And I kind of like writing, so, why not? And anyway, that's basically what I ended up doing. I ended up having a major in history and philosophy of science, where I looked a lot. So my undergraduate thesis was on trusted computing and the big, so Microsoft was bringing in their trusted platform modules at the time. And there was a lot of discussion about whether that would lock people into Microsoft products. Yeah, it was a big drama at the time. They ended up pulling the whole thing, but it's actually back now in a better form. But at the time, it was very, very controversial. And so I wrote about that in trust and what it means to actually trust in a computing system that's that kind of like low level system. And then I thought, oh, well, okay. So I finished that. That was my honors degree. That was my honors undergraduate project. And I was like, okay, back into industry, let's do it. I finished this, I did my computer science project and I did all the computer science stuff and I graduated and I was like, okay, back into industry, let's go. So I worked then as, for a little while, I did a bit of programming as a web programmer. I programmed in Cold Fusion, if anyone remembers that programming language, God. And for a little while, I was the a sysadmin for a Sun Solaris system that basically looked after, you remember the old SMS news that you could get news headlines texted to you? So I had that. I was basically in charge of a set of servers that ran all that at a telecommunications company that went bust as a part of the, I don't know, reorganization of tech companies at the end of the dot-com bust. That was a really dodgy place because basically the whole thing would just fall over every 2 minutes and whoever had set it up had not set up the failover very well. And so I was having to kind of try to replicate what was happening. I had to basically reverse engineer a whole bunch of ridiculous spaghetti systems that had been set up to actually do the pipeline of the news to the text messages make it work properly. But the only time I could test it was when the thing failed over because they wouldn't give me a third. Anyway, it was a real nightmare of a scenario. Anyway, eventually the company went bust and it all went anyway. So I got made redundant at that point, and then I picked up a job, once again another tech support job, but it was I had to drive around to different companies, and when I went for the interview at this place, who I don't think they're still around, but anyway. Yeah, so they basically said, they said, oh yeah, you've got the job, no problem. I went for my interview. They said, oh, you got the job, no problem. And I was like, oh, okay. And then that Friday, they said, oh, we all go to the rugby club for lunch on Fridays. So I went I was the only woman because, girls don't do computers. I was like one of 3 women in my computer science class as well. So like, anyway, and so yeah, there weren't any women basically doing computer science. So I went to so I went to this thing and they said, oh, they all got a few drinks and they got their food and stuff, and they were like, oh, that the only reason that we hired you was so we could have a pretty face around the office. And I was just like, what? But of course that was normal, right? So I was slightly horrified, but I wanted a job. So I kept working there for quite a while later. But I mean, and it was all kind of part of the banter, but these days it's a little bit, not great. But yeah, at least that was better though than the guy I worked for on the, I had another job that was only a couple of days a week. So I picked up another contract job, basically setting up some servers for a fellow who basically stalked me. So, being in industry, not so much for me. I had decided I just kept running into all of these issues, but mostly with like a bunch of sexist men that kind of sucked. And I also, in terms of things like being a web programmer, I did the Cold Fusion and that job. I actually quite enjoyed that. And then they moved to PHP and I enjoyed doing that. But then I found that I was just doing the same thing over and over and over again, re-implementing the same content management schemes. This is before WordPress and all that existed, right? So I had to basically write everything from scratch. And I mean, there was no security back then. You all had like empty root password MySQL databases. That was just standard in industry back then. Like it was pretty terrible. And I mean, there was just the only time you'd ever hear anything as a sysadmin is when things break. Like there's just no thankless, it's a completely thankless task. And I don't really, I thrive more on positive reinforcement than negative, I guess. So I just didn't enjoy being a sysadmin. I wasn't that great a programmer, and I just kept running into these, there was just a lot of sexism that I just kept running into, and it was very frustrating. So I was like, okay, well, I'm obviously sucking at doing all of these jobs, so maybe I'll just go back to university. So I went back to university and I did a PhD in computer ethics. And the reason I did a PhD in computer ethics was I was like, okay, so I got this history and philosophy of science degree. And I'm really interested in this kind of like, how we think more about computers and society and how, people use computers and how it interacts with society. And so I thought I was doing sociology, and I sat down and chatted to John Weckett. This is a very old photo of him, probably circa 2004 or so. And I knitted him that hat. He's a professor. Well, he's a retired professor now, but he used to, he was one of the first Australian, well, he was the first Australian professor of ethics and technology, basically. So anyway, he said, no, he said, you're perfect for this project that I want to work on, which is about computer ethics. So I went and worked with him, and he liked the fact that I had all this industry experience because it meant I could look at things, because he's an applied philosopher. It meant that I could look at things from a kind of a much more practical perspective. And I realized that actually what I was doing in a lot of the discussions that I had with my colleagues at the Centre for Applied Philosophy and Public Ethics, which was in Canberra at the time in Australia, I was having a lot of discussions with my colleagues about the way that you could implement some of the theoretical stuff, like whether it would work in real life, right? Like, can we actually sort of find a way that people will listen to fairly high level philosophy stuff? So I found like I was actually doing a lot of translation, like, yes, this might, it's all well and good sort of saying, yes, well, the theory of utilitarianism is going to work, this is the theory of how this might work in this sort of system. But like, they're not going to care about that. What they want to know is, how easy is it to program? How can you sell it, like the more kind of pragmatic side of things? And so I was trying to sort of translate between the philosophers who are very theoretical and the kind of the practitioners who, many of whom kind of knew something was going on, but didn't really know quite what it was or what to kind of do about it, right? So yeah, so anyway, that meant that I ended up doing quite a practical PhD. So it was essentially, my PhD was on informed consent and it was called informed consent and ICTs. And it was basically about how do you deal with the end user license agreements that popped up. So this is, mid 2000s to late 2000s now. The big thing, there was a lot of problems around end user license agreements because they would pop up, there'd be all this text that nobody would ever read. Sometimes it would link to other end user license agreements. I think one of the ones I analyzed had like a nest of about 7 different applications of end user license agreements deep, which meant that you had to read like almost 100,000 words if you wanted to read the entire set of all the things you'd agree to when you hit OK. And so I basically wrote about how that's not informed consent. It's not, it was not doing even a minimal amount of attempting to actually inform the user in a way that is actually useful to them. So I mocked up a prototype of what could be potentially a useful solution to that. And that was basically through kind of a set of default options that reflected expectations of how software is supposed to work. So, if you're using a word, well, back then, so these days, so the nice thing is expectations change over time, right? But back then, there was an expectation that if you used a word processor, it wasn't going to send your data to a third party, right? These days, of course, we use word processors online, and that is doing that all the time. So we've changed our expectations about how that might work. But the point is that if you if we make an effort to understand what the expectations are and implement those within the technology that we develop, we're going to develop technology that's much more acceptable to users, and they won't get annoyed about the fact that they have to flip through all the text in this end user license agreement. So that's kind of what I ended up doing in terms of my education, and why I ended up technically doing computer ethics for a very, very long time. I thought I was doing sociology. I didn't realize I had to do ethics. I had to go and learn lots and lots of different very fundamental texts that I'd never dealt with before. Like, I had to kind of read a lot about ethics, which I'd not really done before. But fortunately, I was in a good place to do that because I was at the Centre for Applied Philosophy and Public Ethics, right? So there's a lot of ethicists, people doing reading about Kant and Aristotle and Rawls and all sorts of, classic ethical texts. So from a theoretical perspective, I kind of caught up fairly quickly. I felt for a long time like a little bit of an imposter in there, but I'm feeling a lot more relaxed about that these days. Anyway, so after I finished my PhD, I got a postdoc. And in fact, I interviewed for and was accepted, had the job offer for this postdoc before I actually, I think it was after I'd submitted, but I hadn't had my corrections back yet. And so, yeah, anyway, so I moved over to Belgium to start this postdoc, and I was basically working on 2 projects at the University of Namur in Belgium, which was looking at some of the very basic, the European Commission seemed to be concerned about basically what their research programs were going to be developing, and they wanted from what I could tell from these projects, what they were sort of interested in is sort of setting up a series of frameworks or something, some sort of way of making sure they didn't have another Manhattan Project. Essentially, they didn't want to be funding technology or that would come back to bite them from an ethics perspective, right? So they wanted to ensure they had ethical research projects and that people who were doing the research were acting in an ethical way, but in a way that went beyond kind of classic research ethics, which is more sort of around things like consent and making sure people can withdraw from studies and stuff like that. So yeah, so this was really more about how do you actually create, how do you frame and focus, like how do you frame an ethical research project in terms of not just the methods that are conducted within the project, but the outputs and the overall kind of approach that's being taken. So eGaze is very much a theoretical one about kind of looking at like a governance framework, and Etica was very much a kind of exploratory one, looking at what the ethical issues are in some of these emerging research areas, and particularly technological research areas. And they were quite exciting projects to be on, because that's where I met Bernd. So there's the Etica. So Bernd is next to me on the right there. Sorry, Bernd, I did warn you there'd be some photos of you. But yeah, so that was the Etica team, and and then from that I ended up I'll skip over a couple of years, but I want to just focus on these ethical governance projects, because they're all kind of part of a family of projects that the commission the commission was interested in commissioning, right? Because they were really quite concerned about how do we make sure that because the European tradition comes very much out of the precautionary principle, where they want to look and deliberate before kind of making decisions about what society they're building. And there's been a lot of toing and froing about whether that's whether their approach is the best approach, because obviously, I mean, you see America, they have very much the classic kind of move fast and break things approach, whereas the European tradition tends to be a lot more precautionary, right? And so I think the commission, to a certain degree, was looking at how do we make sure we can have this innovation sort of process and try to be kind of innovating in a way that's kind of forward looking, but also making sure that it's done in an ethical way. So is there some sort of way that we can, not necessarily like stop every innovation, but have it kind of start out as on an ethical trajectory and keep on going in that way, rather than breaking things sort of straight out the door, so to speak. So responsible industry, which Bernd led on and I helped to lead with that one. It was very much about looking at, what sorts of responsible innovation processes exist in technology companies, and how can we map those, and what do they look like, and how mature are they? And then there was a series of projects after that. So Compass was very much looking at the small, medium enterprises and how responsible research and innovation can be embedded in those small and medium enterprises. And then Living Innovation was looking much more at responsible innovation in larger companies. And actually the picture that I had back here is actually a picture from one of the workshops that I carried out for Living Innovation, where our responsibility was to do a series of workshops with disadvantaged families in Leicester, looking at what they would like in terms of what they see technology. So it was their visions of technology in 2030 in the home. So what sorts of technologies would they expect to see in the home? What sorts of problems would they like them to solve, et cetera, et cetera. So it was a really exciting project because I really enjoyed working with kids doing that sort of stuff. And also it was one of those lockdown impacted projects where we had to really suddenly pivot from we were originally going to do physical workshops with these families, with the children, to having to do something a little bit more different online. So we ended up doing a design thinking approach where we got families to swap problems and then make up solutions for those problems, and then send those back to the original families, and the families would modify them and see if they fit their purposes. And it was actually quite it was a really fun project in the end, and the families absolutely loved it, and they keep emailing me even now saying, are you going to do anything more like that, because we had so much fun doing it. So I'm one of my future plans is to do something similar to that again, but with a slightly different focus, and where I am now in Stoke-on-Trent, getting involved in the communities there. So anyway, overall though, I feel like my take home from those series of projects, which is that's a lot of years of work, but I think the big take home messages that I got from all of those projects was there's not a lot of point in kind of doing much of this if there's not buy-in at the top. And I think we see there's a lot of problems. There's a lot of big companies out there that have entire responsible innovation teams and technology ethics teams within them. So, Meta is a really good one. Google's got a whole bunch of them, depending on what project it is. But they still have problems because they're not willing to really take it seriously at the top. And when I say take it seriously at the top, the sort of the CEO or the head of that particular area needs to be able to they need to take the responses from their ethics or responsible innovation teams seriously. And the classic thing is, would they be willing to stop a project, right? And a lot of these companies wouldn't for ethical issues, right? And so when it comes down to it, if they won't stop a project because of ethical issues, then it's like that. There's no point almost in having a responsible innovation team, right? Because they're not really being taken seriously. It's a sort of an ethics washing project than anything else. However, the other overall outcome that we have, that I feel like I had from that, is it is really beneficial if it's done correctly. So if they actually do take it seriously and they do implement it properly and they do kind of live their values, then they tend to have better quality products and services and a much happier set of customers and users at the end of it. And I really feel like that's kind of, but I'm not sure if Burnt would have the same outcomes, but these were the ones that I took from these projects, was that it's very much we tried a lot of things and to get kind of companies involved in the projects that we did, and it really ended up being us almost to a certain degree preaching to the choir, right? And a lot of the issues that company that we have from technology is not from these companies that actually care, because they're already 80% of the way there. If they care, they just need a few suggestions on how to implement it well and do things properly and engage with external resources and things like that, right? But it's the companies that say that they care, but they really don't. What they care about is growth or shareholder value or whatever. That's where the problems come in. And so if they're not capable of stopping projects that have obvious issues, and I'm sure we can all name several large company projects that have serious ethical issues here at this point, then they're not taking this stuff seriously, and it's just not. There's no point really, there's no way you can necessarily even engage with them, because they'll just say, oh, well, we've got a whole team that does that, right? But they don't take it seriously. So it's a bit frustrating. Anyway, in between all that, I kind of moved in 2010, I moved over to the UK. And I did a little postdoc just for a year and a half or so that was called the ISIS project. Now, this was before ISIS, the terrorist organization, was kind of doing its thing. And so the name was a little bit controversial, but, afterwards. But anyway, it is what it is. That's what it was called. And what they were doing was they were using natural language processing. So this is back before we had kind of ChatGPT, large language model type things, to detect whether adults were pretending to be children in online chat channels. And so given, we're talking about potential sexual assault, potentially here, and I mean, really bad things potentially happening, there had to be an ethics aspect to this project. And so I was working with Penny Duquesnoy, who used to be the head of ethics at BCS, is from head of the ethics committee. I worked with her for a couple of years on this project, and really the ultimate outcome was not as it was quite controversial, right? So the claims were from the tech team was that they were able to do this all live. So what they did is they wrote essentially a natural language processing tool that would sit on a chat channel and detect whether the person speaking in the chat channel was a child or an adult pretending to be a child. And they had a whole bunch of quite controversial kind of interactions where they would test their thing against and compare it to how children would pick it up. So they had their tester that was like 89% accurate or something in working out whether it was a child or an adult pretending to be a child. But then they set children the same task, and the children were just terrible at it. They couldn't tell if it was another child or if it was an adult pretending to be a child. So this got a few headlines at the time because, of course, there were a lot of, there's always a bit of a panic around pedophiles and grooming, online grooming. And I mean, obviously it's very problematic when it does occur. So it is good to have a go. But we worked with CEOP, which is the Child Exploitation Online something, I can't remember, but yeah, they're basically the organization that works with like alongside police to kind of investigate these cases, right? And we found along the way that they were very, very blinkered about how this tool would be used. So the problem that we had was that if you've got a tool that's only 89% accurate detecting whether you're an adult pretending to be a child or not, there's a lot of potential false negatives that could come up with that, right? So false positives, sorry. And one of the worst things that can be done in society at the moment is accusing someone of being a pedophile when they're not actually a pedophile, right? And so there were at the time, a lot of high profile cases of this happening as well. Like this was a big concern about this particular tool. So we wanted to make sure that they weren't going to be using it live, for example, to flag up to police that someone was pretending to be a child in a chat channel. And another thing that we wanted to make sure was that, there's a lot of reasons why adults might be in children's chat channels to start with that aren't bad. Basically, it could be a parent looking to keep an eye on their kid, which is a bit weird, but it's not illegal. It could be someone who has learning difficulties, who can't relate to other adults, for example, as well as they can to children, who just wants to have a friend, and so there's a lot of problems that could come up with this otherwise great seeming device, right? And in the end, what they ended up doing was they released it as an application for kids to use within chat channels to flag up to them whether they were talking to a child or an adult. And they also used it they gave it to the police essentially to run over existing computers that they've seized as part of investigations to see if they do that sort of behavior on chat logs. So originally, we managed to kind of talk them down from doing this live, essentially, and flagging up and calling the police anytime it flagged somebody up, to something that was a lot more kind of ethically acceptable in terms of potential social, working with these trade-offs in terms of the prevention of harm to children, but also prevention of harm to people that are innocent. right? So that was that particular one. It was a very interesting project. And I think it was interesting that it kind of foreshadowed a lot of the problems that we still have today, right? I mean, there was a big report about Roblox that's just come out recently, which is a big game platform that is aimed mostly at children, that there's a lot of this grooming behavior and a lot of sexual behavior that goes on in Roblox. And the fact is that these sorts of tools have obviously, I mean, this was a fairly primitive tool back, quite a long time ago in terms of, technology life, right? The life cycle of technology. And it wasn't that great, but it still did a reasonable job, right? But they haven't solved this problem even with much better technology. And I think that there's a lot to say about whether that sort of issue is actually solvable by technology. And I don't think it necessarily is. It's a social problem as well as a technological problem. And there needs to be a lot better combination of those two things to actually happen to minimize that. But also it requires, once again, companies to actually be invested in solving these problems for the right reasons. And then one of the reasons that we have problems with the Roblox has still got these problems is that they were not seeing the ethical issues as being the primary, like they weren't actually seeing the protection of children as being the primary goal. They were seeing basically their company that was melting down and in terms of shareholder value and trying to prop that up, right? And so that's completely wrong. Like it's a completely wrong set of values to have when you're working on a platform that caters to children. It's quite a nasty case. I would recommend a strong stomach if you go and look at the Roblox stuff, by the way. So content warning there. Right, so after that, I joined De Montfort University, where I got a lectureship, and I started getting cross at stuff. So basically, my whole kind of academic life, well, not just my academic life, I guess my real life as well, I just get kind of cranky about things and I write stuff and people sometimes listen to them. But I got really cross with Facebook quite a lot because Facebook was doing really stupid stuff and I just got mad that they weren't listening. Like they just seem to be doing their own thing and not actually thinking about anything other than their own. Like they're just being kind of quite greedy and selfish and move fast, break things, right? So the Facebook emotional manipulation study came out, which was a big coup that basically a big report that showed how Facebook was using their timeline to basically they had an A/B type test where they set up a timeline that was mostly positive posts for one set of users, and they set up a timeline that was mostly negative posts for another set of users, and then they compared them to see what sorts of content that those people posted afterwards. And they basically said, yeah, look, okay, if you see lots of happy stuff, you're more likely to post happy stuff. If you see lots of sad stuff, you're more likely to post sad stuff. And there was some excuse me, there was some evidence to show that the people who saw the negative stuff were more likely to claim were more likely to present symptoms of depression, anxiety, and things like that. So the big problem they had there, and the thing that I got very cross about, was they weren't telling these people that they were actually experimenting on them. And so they hadn't gone through a classic informed consent process. And it basically was really, really unethical. And there was quite a bit of outcry at the time. But because I just written this whole PhD on informed consent, I felt like I was in a particular place to actually write something quite cutting about that from an informed consent perspective. So I wrote that and published it in a journal. There was a special issue of a journal all about the emotional manipulation study. And then Cambridge Analytica happened about 1.5 or 2 years later. The whole Cambridge Analytica stuff came out about how they were manipulating timelines to, in all sorts of, and using people's tests that they were doing, like personality tests, are then used to decide what sorts of content to present them and things like that, all without letting the users know. And that caused a huge outcry. And all of a sudden, people started reading my paper about informed consent in this manipulation study, and so yeah, that went around again and got a lot of citations after that. because, yeah, once again, Facebook was doing exactly the same thing. They weren't actually treating their users as people, they were treating them as data points. And that was one of the big issues that I had with Facebook. Then later on, I got cross this year. This is only a couple of years ago now. I got very cross about with Facebook again. So just before they turned into Meta, they piloted these augmented reality glasses, which are called Aria. And they had this whole thing about how responsible they were, and they had a whole responsible innovation team, and their responsible innovation team had written up all of these these like guidelines that they had to follow and all this sort of stuff. And a colleague of mine, Sally Applin, we sat down and we wrote a paper about how they failed all of their own responsible innovation tests. They weren't at all responsible according to their own framework, let alone any external framework. And then I looked at this against kind of classic responsible innovation and the ACM's code of ethics, and basically it was yeah, I'd like to say that I didn't contribute to the dissolution of the responsible innovation team there, but I suspect that this paper had something to do with it, because for a while I was certainly persona non grata at Meta. This definitely, like, we were reached out to by the responsible innovation team lead to come and consult with them, which we said no to, because, you know, the classic trap, right? You get asked to come and consult, and then if they listen to you, they say they consulted with you. If they don't listen to you, they still say that they consulted with you, right? So you're kind of linked forever with that, whatever decision they come up with, even if you disagreed with it. So shortly after, there was a bunch of outcry about that. Their responsible innovation team was dissolved about a year later, I think, and was moved around to other parts, but they still have some responsible innovation stuff on their augmented reality glasses page, but it's very watered down and very hand wavy compared with what it was before. And that's kind of like, on the one hand, I'm actually kind of annoyed that that was the sort of impact that we had. It was actually like, it made it worse, right? It's not really sort of the impact that you'd like to have as an academic. You'd kind of like them to do better, but actually it turns out they've just done worse. So I don't know. It's just Facebook. I think I'm just going to be constantly forever in a battle with them in terms of their approach to ethics. But anyway, yeah. So yeah, I also got mad about them about their whole metaverse thing, but that's another story. But anyway, all right. So somewhere around 2018, it must have been a bit before that, 2017 or so, I was asked, because of all of this stuff that I've been doing, and I've been getting cross at things quite a lot, and I've been going to conferences where I met some cool people and talking about whatever cross thing I was doing at the time. I mean, I'm giving you kind of the greatest hits here, because like I got very angry about a lot of stuff as I went. Like my whole life, I've just been getting angry at things and writing about them. That's basically like that's my career trajectory. So anyway, because I was I guess writing reasonably sensible things about this, I got some. I was invited to come and help rewrite the ACM's code of ethics, and so Don Goddeban and Marty Wolf, who, well, at the time they were the chair and the vice chair of the ACM's Committee on Professional Ethics. They thought I might have some slightly younger perspectives, I guess, and also I was one of the few women on the team, and I was also one of the few non-Americans on the team. And honestly, before I got to it, it was very American centric. So I felt like I helped at least, quite significantly on that side of things. But we did a lot of work to actually try to rebuild it from scratch. Essentially, like we had a very basic draft of what we wanted, but the original code of ethics there was from 1992, and basically the whole thing was a lot of it was out of date. I mean, it still talked about securing physical spaces, for example, instead of online spaces and things like that. The internet hadn't been invented really, so like there was a lot of stuff that we needed to kind of catch up on. So we did a series of drafts that had a lot of member feedback, which was really good, including one massive survey that had like 4,000 plus responses from the membership, where I had to go through and do a qualitative analysis of like it was like 30 something questions per person. So it was ridiculous. Anyway, the key thing is that the outcome of it was very significantly membership driven, and also like we turned it from a kind of a thou shalt not stick approach to a more aspirational code of ethics, that we wanted not just members to be for it to be useful to members, but also to what we call aspiring members, so like students and so on. So some of the key additions that we added there, I mean, we got rid of a lot of this kind of physical security stuff and stuff that was out of date. But some of the key additions that we added was, at the time, there were lots of controversy about Microsoft retiring versions of Windows that were out of date, but like a lot of places are still using. So like the NHS was a big issue there when they retired. I think it was at Windows 7. Or even Windows 95 and 98. Yeah, so retiring systems, the extra responsibility that people have, that companies have to kind of support the migration away from older systems. Things about when technology becomes more integrated into society. So we wanted to capture kind of the social media, the integration of social media into society and other kind of integrations of technology into society like that. We wanted to make sure that these companies understand they have a higher responsibility to their users than, you know, if they were just a smaller kind of niche app or something like that. We also put in a very small amount about machine learning. We didn't really, the problem is we wanted to future-proof it. So we basically kind of couch machine learning in the words of, essentially, if you don't know what the outputs of your software are going to be, you need to monitor it a lot more thoroughly. At the time, the time we did this, the big example was that Taybot that Microsoft put onto Twitter, and immediately got trolled. Well, it basically just got fed a whole load of really nasty stuff and started parroting it back. And so we wanted to kind of make sure that that sort of ethical issue was captured. There was also not very much about discrimination in the previous code of ethics, so we added a whole lot of stuff about discrimination and how that's not a good idea. But the other key thing was that we wanted to make sure that, so I think in the previous code, it was very much about professionalism and being a good professional, but what we wanted to shift the focus on was that people need to think of the public good, right? That if you're going to be a professional, the public good is paramount. So any decision you make, if you can't weigh up the values and decide what is most important, you need to consider the public good as the key issue to consider. So this code of ethics was very successful. Like, we've had really, really good feedback about it. It took a long time. I mean, I went over to Chicago several times and sat in a hotel room for like 3 days straight and just did writing and arguing, and, you know, it was really, really fun though. It was probably one of the best things I've done. It was a really good experience. And it's been taken up by other organizations. So IFIP, the International Federation for Information Processing, has taken it up. And there's like lots and lots of other places that have adapted it or taken it up and use it for their own members. But it still suffers, unfortunately, from the fact, like the biggest downside of the ACM Code of Ethics, this is the same, like I think the BCS is looking at redoing theirs. The biggest issue that we've run into really is that it still is only for individuals, and there's nothing really that you can do about kind of like bigger systems and companies. You can't really hold a company to the code of ethics because I mean, although it can be used as a benchmarking tool, like it's very much aimed at individuals because individuals are members of the ACM and not companies. So there's a gap there that needs to be filled, and there's nothing really at the moment that does that. So yeah, we'll wait and see. So some other things I got cross with. I see we're coming up to time, so I'll go through these quickly. I got very angry about crypto and AI for hopefully obvious reasons. I mean, the fact that crypto was basically a massive scam. There was a lot of lack of transparency, like the white papers they publish are just full of jargon that nobody in their right mind would be able to read. So that kind of goes back to my informed consent stuff. There were lots of issues with environmental impact. There still are, but back at the time, there's a big thing about NFTs being on Ethereum, and there's a lot of issues with the environmental impact of these NFTs, apart from the fact that they're mostly a scam as well. And despite the fact that there's now what they call a crypto winter, I mean, crypto is still going strong. And crypto bros are kind of regrouping and trying to find the latest, greatest pitch to try to get more people back into crypto. So crypto games is now a space I'm looking at, because I think that's one of the ways they're going to kind of try to make crypto more kind of acceptable and accessible to people that wouldn't normally be interested in crypto. And obviously the AI hype cycle. So my big thing with the AI hype cycle is about basically a call to resist this hype, based on, like, same with the crypto side of things. A lot of stuff was promised in the future, and there was lots of stuff that was like, people put a lot of money in for things that would never come to pass, right? And I think we're at the same space now with AI, certainly the large language model based AI, where we're starting to see that, yeah, these promises that a lot of these companies have made are not actually going to happen, or at least not anytime in, you know, feasible investment time, right? And so I think there's this whole issue with the reliance on future gains to sell stuff now. There's a lot, yeah, it's just not a feasible way to do this, and it's basically I think it's a little bit of a scam, basically. There are some similarities also to crypto in terms of the environmental sustainability of modern AI. But I think, like, the reality, like I said, is starting to set in. But there's also this sunk cost fallacy. So that, you know, these big investors that can afford to will kind of chuck in some good money after bad money for a while, just like they did with crypto, to see if these companies can actually do what they say they were going to do. But I don't think they will. So that's my hot take on that. And then I went into games. So over a long time, I used to go to PAX East. Up until I had children, I used to go to PAX East every year, and I had this is my very picture there is of my very first booth, where I literally had like a bit of cardboard where I printed out some stuff. And it was really fun. I talked to people who came to PAX East, the big games convention where gamers come and they find out about the latest games that are coming out, and they get to play some of the latest games and stuff. And I had a little booth in a place called the Diversity Lounge, which was aimed at drawing attention to the diverse groups that work within games. So there was a lot of like Able Gamers, which is a disability charity. There were LGBT charities. There were women in games type charities and things like that, all kind of working, having with booths and stalls and things in this room. So I found myself in there after talking to the right people. And I just had this little thing where I asked people how they felt about games, what they did in games, and, you know, how they felt about them. And I collected loads and loads of Post-it notes over about 7 or 8 years. And I think I might be finally writing a paper about them, but you'll be pleased to know eventually I finally got a paper coming, you know, only about 10, 12, 14 years later. So yes, but anyway, along the way, in terms of games, games has been something that I've kind of bubbled along the side, because I love games. I do get angry about games, but I don't get angry about the games in the same way I get angry about crypto, or whatever. I find games as a really positive space to work in. I mean, there's lots of issues with games, obviously, but I see a lot more promise and positivity within games in terms of bringing people together and helping to connect people and increasing well-being. And I think there's a big space there to explore in terms of the positive aspects of games. So this is where I'm kind of placed myself now. So over the years, I've done weird papers about chickens in games. I've worked on the No Man's Sky archaeology project, which looked at No Man's Sky as a big open world game where you can visit different planets. And some archaeologists, friends of mine who also love games, they decided to conduct an archaeological dig within this game because it sort of gave them the tools to do that. So we had a whole project on that, which was really fun. I did a paper about Pokemon Go when Pokemon Go was big, which was a really interesting and fun paper to write. And basically these days I do big collaborations. So I've got a collaboration looking at big data using Unity. If anyone's familiar with the game engine Unity, we have a lot of access to their monetization and playtime data. I do stuff about ethics in games more generally. And I've just, as of today, become the editor-in-chief of ACM Games Research and Practice. So that's kind of a nice cherry on the top of that cake. But all of this stuff led to me becoming a professor of ethics and games technology at Staffordshire University, which is where I am now. And I gave a little TEDx talk about AI, of all things, which is about actually general technology ethics. And if you're interested in that sort of stuff, you can look that up. So yeah, the future though, where are we? So this is my the games program at Staffordshire University, or sorry, University of Staffordshire, is really, really big. And this is just our first year cohort. So it's a big cohort. That's not me speaking, obviously, but this was at our welcome week that we did a couple of weeks ago. But I think that the reason I have that picture there is I think these people are sort of at the future of exploring, developing spaces in which we can explore different ethical problems. And I find games a really interesting space in terms of things like experimentation, trying out different, like simulation. I think is really a really interesting space to think of from an ethics perspective. But I think there's also a lot of challenges to tackle, right? So things like looking at kids and technology and their relationship with technology. And as a parent to two small children, I feel that very much as a personal thing. I think the AI issues are going to continue to steamroll along, and I think there'll be the next AI as well, right? So whatever the next AI is going to have similar issues to crypto AI. I think whatever these very rich people that like to throw money at that sort of thing, like they'll find something else, and that'll be the next one of those. So we have to keep our eye out for that. There's a lot of discussion about breaking up big companies, which I think probably should happen because of the fact that they just don't actually care about people anymore. And how do we deal with hype cycles? So how do we actually deal with all of this like sudden transition to technology that we haven't really fully tested, or that has obvious ethical issues that nobody's willing to actually address or stop the project with. So, I mean, as I say here, the problem is that people at the top don't want to deal with this stuff. And how do we change that? And that's a project for the ages, I think. I don't think I'm going to solve that problem, unfortunately, but we'll find out. So the growth at all cost mindset, this sort of fear of missing out, these two big companies, billionaires, all of this kind of, there's the elephant in the room is sort of capitalism to a certain degree as well, right? So there's all of these things kind of feed into each other and kind of are a part of this big network. And I think there's some big shifts that need to happen for the issues that I was talking about, back about the European projects that I did. I mean, there was never, I don't think they were ever going to be able to touch any of these bigger issues because they are such big issues. So I think it's a lot more complicated than just don't make bad technology, right? And I think that there's a lot to be, the fact that we're able to kind of start unpacking some of these things is really good, and that people care, like everyday people obviously care a lot about the technology that they use. So I think we need to find ways to kind of capture that and use that to kind of push back against some of the poorer behavior that we see. So I guess this slide set had a call to action card in it. I thought, yeah, okay, I'll use that. This is me giving a talk about chickens and games, by the way. So I guess, my call to action is for people at home to think, are you building the world that you want to live in, or that you want your children to live in? And, if you are, that's fantastic. But then think about, well, how can you expand your horizons? Is it just about the world you want to live in, or the world that we should all be living in, right? And it's about bringing in other people's perspectives and broadening out our own understandings of the world, and kind of following kind of other paths to see what sort of changes we can make along those paths as well. How can we expand those horizons and kind of broaden out our own expectations of what technology should be doing for us, right? And then also, how can you push back against poor practice? And I mean, we've seen the rise of unions in America, for example. I mean, in the UK, it's a little bit different. But I think the Americans are showing kind of the roller coaster, like the peaks and the troughs, right? So they've gone through a phase of very strong company power, and now we're starting to see a bit of people power coming back again. And I think there's some interesting things to watch in America in terms of pushing back against companies. So yeah, so I think this is my two kids. We're at Electromagnetic Field there, which is a hacker maker festival that I help to run every 2 years, where I run the content of that, and it's good fun. And that's my two kids. And yeah, basically I'm happy to take some questions. I realize it's been a bit of a ramble, but there's people still in the room, so it must have been vaguely interesting to somebody. But yeah, happy to take questions.
Hi, Catherine. It's Suki here.
Hi, Suki. Yes.
I think you should have a drink first of all, because
you know what? There was one thing I forgot to bring was a glass of water. I'm anyway. Yeah.
I'm amazed that you could speak for nearly an hour without taking a little chug of a bottle or something. But yeah, that's a skill I definitely need to get. So thank you for that. I mean, that was really fascinating. I mean, a lot of memories for me as well. I think I was probably a few years older than you, but I was in the whole .com boom, and
yep.
Because I remember they were going after COBOL contractors getting paid silly rates at that time as well.
Yeah, my dad was contracted back for the Millennium Bug. Yeah.
And in some ways, it was quite upsetting that nothing happened.
It shows well planned. Well, it was well planned, right?
Yeah. I mean, what's quite fascinating to me is how you've gone from, I'd say, a techie, yeah, and you've kind of diced on the side of a social science, yeah. But I still get the feeling that what you're doing in ethics is still quite techie.
Yeah.
And I was just kind of intrigued to know, is it, would you say it's more social science, or is it more technology? Kind of, where does it kind of sit?
Yeah, well, this is the question, right? So I'm definitely not. I mean, I call myself a philosopher to annoy other philosophers, right? And because I see myself very much as an applied philosopher, right? And I think for me, I think it's important to keep the techie side, because if you don't have the techie side, nobody's going to listen to you, right? So if I can talk about things, I mean, I'm teaching computational methods at the moment to first years, right? And I can talk about how to represent linked lists and stuff like that. But then, so that gives me cred to be able to then say, hey, but maybe you should do this in a way that's not going to seriously harm people, so there's a benefit to kind of having that technical capability. And I actually do enjoy programming. I'm very much an itch scratch programmer. I like solving problems, and I've written a whole bunch of really stupid things over the years, but like just little things that have annoyed me, and I've written programs to solve them, right? But I think it's good to kind of keep that, because like there's a lot I see, especially in the AI field, right? There are a lot of the people that get listened to are those who've come out of AI, right? So who've been the techie people, right? There's a lot of philosophers who can write endless treatises on the philosophy of all of that, but I think there's definitely a place for that. Don't get me wrong. If they didn't exist, I wouldn't have anything to kind of work with, right? Like, so I very much see myself as this kind of this translator in some ways. I feel like I'm a bridge between the two worlds, and I think yeah, I mean, I think that's an important. It means I'm not particularly good at either of them, but I'm quite good at do you know what I mean? But I'm a bit of a diplomat, I'm quite good at I feel like I'm quite good at, which I think is also made me more flexible. So I've been able to follow these paths because I understand how technology works. I've been quite able to kind of say, look, okay, this is why crypto is not a great idea, and here's why AI, modern AI is not is harmful, and so I can be quite flexible like that. So I think it's I don't think it's too late for tech people to get, if they want to do that sort of thing. Like, it's never going to be too late to do that. I think it probably helps to have a little bit of philosophy or some social science under your belt. I mean, a lot of the actual research that I do is very social science based. So I do a lot of interviews, questionnaires, qualitative stuff, focus groups, workshops, that sort of stuff, which is all very classic sort of social science data gathering, right? So I think but I mean, more recently I've been doing big data stuff, but I'm not a statistician. So I get somebody else to do the stats. I just ask difficult questions, right? So these are the sort of spaces to work in, but I appreciate it's a bit of a weird niche, which is why I was sort of like, well, this is not so much how to get a job in it, but this is what I did and now I'm here kind of thing. So
Yeah, it's really interesting because again, I think you're probably the first ethicist in IT that I've met. Because generally, I mean, I've been in technology for 28 years, and it's you obviously know that there's two sides to it. I mean, I didn't realize there were two sides because since I was young, I was really into anything innovation technology wise, and I saw it just for good. And then my brother he's a school teacher teaching 11 to 16-year-olds, and the moment we got camera phones that could record, yeah, for me that's like, wow, I don't have to carry a camcorder anymore. But for him in school, people were doing that. I don't know if you heard of that thing where happy slapping, where they slap a kid and they video it at the same time. And I was like, oh my God, there's two sides of technology. There's a darker side as well.
yeah.
So yeah, it's quite interesting because I never really realized that there were people in this space. I knew there were people thinking about these different things, but not necessarily technologists, because I always thought technologists thought it was one way or another.
Yeah, I think the big thing I get a lot is the classic, oh, technology, it's neutral, right? And it's always that is always the big thing that they say, oh, yeah, but technology is neutral. It's about how you use it, and I think that's the big thing I've been fighting against in my whole career, is actually getting people to understand that no, you embed your values into what you create. And sometimes it might be like, doesn't matter, right? Most of the time it probably won't matter, especially if you're doing like low level fundamental stuff, right? But if you're creating an app that does a thing, you've probably baked some presuppositions into that about how people behave, or, what they are, how they, what their backgrounds are, or something like that. And that will reflect your own values and your own background. And just getting people, and I see this with students a lot, like it's always like the penny kind of drops at some point where they start to realize, oh yeah, I am actually building this with a bunch of background, that I hadn't thought about before, right? The blinkers kind of come off, right? So yeah.
I'm also quite intrigued in your opinion around AI. I mean, again, I'm really fond of it. And I'll give you an example. Yesterday, I was driving back from Coventry, and I was using ChatGPT's advanced voice mode. And I've been over the last. It's been out in the UK for like a couple of weeks now, maybe a month now. I can't remember. And I've been teaching it various things, like about me. And then when we have a conversation, I find it fascinating because it remembers everything about me. Like it knows I've got a dog called Marley and all this kind of stuff. And I'm like, this is brilliant because I can ask somebody questions about any topic in the world, yeah, and they'll give me some kind of answer, and it almost feels humanistic in some ways, almost does. But obviously, that's just one side of it.
Yeah.
What's your view around the ethics?
I think that the issue there is that you could become sort of over reliant on it, right, in some ways. And I mean, the thing is, there's well established research that shows that we give computers a lot more like we basically, it's a classic, like that Little Britain sketch, right? The computer says no, right? We don't tend to question what machines tell us, right? And we're really bad. Even when we know they're not going to be perfect, we expect them to be perfect. And there's like so many examples over history where we expect technology to just work, right? But it doesn't always just work. In fact, it fails quite a lot. And I mean, if you're a programmer, just how much you have to do, how much time you spend on debugging stuff, right? But I think, that's one of, and so there's sort of over reliance on that. And then without like the lack of questioning when it's wrong, right? And then what's the recourse when it does get things wrong? Who's responsible for it getting something wrong, right? I mean, imagine, someone asks your AI system, oh, Suki's just had an accident, who should I call? And it starts talking about someone that doesn't exist, for example. And like there's I mean, it's not the best example, but it's
I know what you mean. Yeah, you
Yeah,
can have
yeah.
a reliance on it, and then the computers are only as good as what people feed them.
Exactly, right. And then we're going to run in at some point, we're going to run into the Ouroboros problem, right? Where we're starting to feed stuff back in that they've generated, right? And so um that becomes a different level of issue with the actual training side of things. But then, I mean, there's also just the environmental sustainability issues. I mean, the amount of energy that it takes to actually train these systems is incredible. Even just the queries that you do. I was reading a thing about, I mean, how much water it takes is always a weird metric, I think, but
Yeah,
I mean, it apparently takes like quite a lot of water to produce the results to one query, right? And I think, you know, whether or not you agree on the amounts of water or whatever, I think it goes to show that I think that the underlying thing is that it does, what does it provide for that energy cost, right? And if it's a fun toy that you occasionally use, you know, is that really worth that sort of energy expenditure? Does it actually really give you anything that is actually worth that amount of energy expenditure? I mean, if it was sort of life-saving technology, then maybe, but then where do you draw this line, right? And these are conversations that we have to have as a society to a certain degree, because how do we then regulate companies that want to just make stupid toys that spend, you know, loads of energy that don't actually do anything beneficial for us in our lives? Do you know what I mean?
yeah. I was thinking of that AI pin. I don't know if you remember it.
Yes, yeah, pin. Yeah, exactly. Something like that, right?
But something I read recently that somebody hacked the Meta AI glasses. I
Yes.
don't know if you saw that. Yeah, where it
Yeah,
basically gets people's pictures, gets it, and then scans it across the internet, and they can have conversations with them knowing who they were, which is really freaky.
really
Um,
creepy. Yep.
yeah, my last question is you said that you're a lecturer. So is there more women in IT? Because I mean, I'm not seeing them basically. I
No,
don't think it's I see them in sales and I see them in service management and various other places, but
I
less so.
mean, we exist. We're just, I mean, it's sort of, you know, it's not a, I mean, there was a fairly concerted effort to get women, and particularly there's because in academia you have the dual issue of academia plus tech, right? And I mean,
Yeah.
there's a notable, I mean, although it's getting better, like the academia side of things getting a lot better in terms of numbers of women in academia, but numbers of women in tech in academia very limited. So I mean, I'm in a games
Mm.
department. This is a video games department, right? So it's a fairly, I mean, I would say this is actually on the worst side of things in terms of representation, because it's got the double whammy of it being a fairly new industry,
Yeah.
and also the fact that it's a lot of people who've come from technology, from tech into to go into games, right? So it's mostly, so it's sort of a bit of a and it's a newer, riskier industry, if that makes sense as well. And it's an
Yeah.
industry that's classically bad for women. I mean, like, look at, if you do look at anything in the video games industry, it's all about crunch, it's about bad work life experience, you know, work life
Mm.
balance. It's not really the space for you know, families and things like that. So it's a space where women tend to kind of like leave fairly early on in their
Mm.
careers. But I mean, it is getting better, but it's still pretty grim. So I'm in a games department. We have roughly 67 staff, and I'm one of, I'd say, I don't think we have double digits women in that. So yeah, I mean, maybe a fifth of us um are women. Not, yeah, not even, wouldn't even say even that. But what's nice though is that we have three
Mhm.
professors in games at Staffordshire, and two of us are women. So we're hoping that we're going to start a change from the top down at least. But yeah, I mean, we've yeah, it's a very difficult industry to be in still. And I mean, there's
Mm.
been a lot of work done, but the pipe, they talk about the leaky pipeline a lot in women, with women in tech. There's, you know, they start out a lot doing computing at school or whatever, and then eventually they sort of they leak out of the pipe, and we've got to find where the leaks are, right? But I think it still just comes down to all of the classic yeah, I mean, there's still a lot of sexism. There's still a lot of the
Mhm.
fact that you still have to kind of work twice as hard to you know, as a man to get the same kind of jobs and things like that, and promotions and things. And it's, yeah, it's, and you know, if you want to go have a family, I mean, to as large degree, I'm very lucky because I was in academia. I was able to go and have 2 children and come back, and my career was still, you know, pretty well intact, right? And I mean, you know, much credit to my colleagues and also to the universities for supporting me on that. But you know, I think there are some things that are much better than they certainly were back when I started. And there's, you know, a lot more of a culture of calling out bad behavior, but there's still just, yeah, it's still there. It's just, yeah, it's a hard nut to crack, that one.
Yeah, I think it's a hard sell as well, because I've got 7 nieces and I've tried to convince every single one of them to go into technology, because it is quite it's a good career, you know, for sure.
Yeah, it is. It
Mm.
is. Yeah.
But they all
Yeah. I
like
mean,
social sciences and
there's some interesting spaces now. There's like the whole there's an article recently in the Guardian about femtech and how
um,
women-led startups are less likely to get funded, and women-led startups of femtech companies are even less likely to get funded. And so there's a huge there's lots and lots of pressures that just sort of like lots of little things that add up over time that means that you don't see women in positions in leading positions in technology. Yeah.
well, thank you very much for the talk. I
Oh,
really
thank you.
appreciate it.
Thanks very much for coming. Yeah. Any other questions?